In the first week of March 2026, an official from a brand new coalition of Kurdish political parties told an Israeli news outlet that thousands of armed Kurdish fighters had just crossed into Iranian territory. Let's start with where this coalition actually came from, because you can't understand the March claims without understanding what had just been built in the weeks before them. On February 22, 2026, 5 major Iranian Kurdish opposition parties formally united under a single banner for the first time in the movement's history, forming the coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan known as CPFIK. According to detailed tracking of the crisis, that coalition brought together groups with genuinely different ideological roots: the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the Kurdistan Freedom Party known as PAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party known as PJAK, and multiple branches of the Kamala Party, some of them historically Marxist, some more nationalist, all of them sharing decades of armed and political struggle against the Islamic Republic dating back to the earliest days of Kurdish nationalism in Iran. That unification happened just 1 week before Israel and the United States launched their coordinated strikes on Iran on February 28th, according to Al Jazeera's reporting on the Kurdish groups Washington was working to rally, which is exactly the kind of timing that made outside observers immediately start asking whether these groups were about to play a much bigger role in the war than they ever had in any previous round of unrest. Here's your first gut check, because I want you thinking critically from minute one instead of just accepting the headline version of this story. According to CNN's reporting, published March 3rd, multiple sources familiar with the matter confirmed the CIA was actively working to arm Kurdish forces, specifically with the goal of fomenting a popular uprising inside Iran. The Trump administration, according to that same reporting, had been in active discussions with Iranian opposition groups and Kurdish leaders based in Iraq about providing military support. That's not a rumor or a Kurdish party's own claim about itself. That's CNN's own sourcing on direct American government involvement, confirmed through multiple people familiar with the plan. So heading into March, you had a newly unified Kurdish coalition, a Kurdish population with thousands of fighters already stationed along the Iraq-Iran border, and a documented American covert program actively trying to arm and mobilize exactly those fighters. That's the real backdrop the offensive claims landed on top of. So let's get into what was actually reported. On March 4th, I-24 News, an Israeli outlet, published an exclusive citing an unnamed CPFIK official who said Kurdish armed groups based in Iraq had already begun a military offensive against Iranian regime forces. According to that official, fighters affiliated with PJAK began taking combat positions inside Iranian territory starting at midnight on March 2nd. The official told the outlet directly, quote, "The ground military movements by Kurdish forces against Iran have already started since the midnight of March 2nd. He went further, claiming Iranian forces had evacuated the border city of Marwan on March 3rd and were establishing defensive positions around it in response, and that thousands of PJAK fighters were already deployed deep inside Iran's mountainous regions, particularly in the Zagros range near Marwan in western Iran. That's the specific claim your title is referencing, and on its face, it's an enormous story, an actual foreign-backed ground insurgency, opening a genuine second front inside Iran while the country was already absorbing sustained American and Israeli airstrikes. Here's your second gut check, and this is where the story gets a lot more complicated than the initial headline suggested. Within roughly 48 hours, according to detailed tracking of the crisis compiled from multiple sources, PJAK, PDKI, PAK, and Kamala, every single Kurdish party actually named in the original I-24 News report publicly denied that a formal offensive had been launched. Journalist Afshin Ismaili, covering the story in real time, reported that 4 separate Iranian Kurdish officials specifically denied the ground offensive claim, telling him the only actual development that day was the Kurdistan regional government deploying its own forces to secure border cities, not launching an incursion into Iran itself. That's a genuinely significant walkback. 4 named political organizations, on the record, distancing themselves from a story that had already gone semi-viral across defense-focused media within a single news cycle. So, which version is true? Based on the fuller picture that emerged over the following weeks, the honest answer is somewhere in between the two extremes, and I think walking through that nuance is actually the most valuable thing this video can do for you. According to a detailed on-the-ground account published by Palladium magazine in April, drawing on a visit to a Kurdistan Freedom Party training camp just outside Erbil weeks before the war even began, the coalition's combined force is estimated to sit in the high thousands, but those fighters are spread thin across the entire length of the Iraq-Iran border, and are, in that reporting's own words, lightly equipped. Separate detailed tracking of the crisis concluded that what actually happened in early March involved advanced positioning and limited infiltration, rather than a large-scale, coordinated military assault, at least as of mid-March. So thousands of fighters is likely an accurate description of the coalition's total available manpower. A coordinated offensive that captured territory and forced Iran into a full defensive evacuation is very likely an exaggeration, probably originating from a single unnamed source with an obvious motive to make Kurdish capability sound as large and as imminent as possible at the exact moment Washington and Jerusalem were deciding how much support to actually commit. That caution about becoming too closely identified with American and Israeli objectives isn't unique to Saleh either. It runs through how a lot of Kurdish political analysts have talked about this entire war. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, one analyst covering the coalition, Rogers, noted that support from the U.S. is helpful, especially in terms of targeting Iranian security infrastructure with airstrikes, but that Kurdish groups would likely remain cautious about relying too heavily on Washington, specifically citing how the United States has abandoned Kurdish partners before, most notably in Syria. That historical memory sits underneath almost every strategic decision these parties have made throughout this entire war. A movement that has watched American support arrive and then evaporate before in a different country, under a different administration, has every incentive to hedge its public statements carefully, projecting enough strength and momentum to keep foreign backing flowing, while never fully committing its own credibility to promises that outside powers have broken before and could break again. I want to be really direct about why that distinction matters. Because it's not just a fact-checking footnote, it goes to the heart of how wars like this one actually get covered while they're happening. An unnamed official telling a friendly outlet that an offensive has already begun is a form of pressure and signaling in its own right, aimed as much at potential American and Israeli backers weighing how much support to provide as it is aimed at Iran itself. If you can convince Washington that Kurdish forces are already fighting and winning ground, that's a much stronger pitch for continued or increased support than if you're asking for help before anything has actually started. That doesn't necessarily mean the official was lying outright. Positioning fighters and probing across a lightly defended border is a real, documented activity. Even Palladium's on-the-ground reporting confirms the coalition existed and had real fighters ready to move. But there's a meaningful difference between fighters massing and probing near a border and thousands of them having already conducted a coordinated offensive deep into Iranian territory. And that's exactly the gap between what got claimed and what 4 separate Kurdish organizations were willing to publicly confirm days later. It's worth understanding just how deep the roots of this specific struggle actually go, because none of this started in February of 2026. According to detailed tracking of Kurdish separatism in Iran, the fight for Kurdish self-determination inside the country stretches back to the early 20th century, through repeated tribal uprisings and the rise of organized Kurdish nationalism, culminating in 1946 when Qazi Muhammad declared a short-lived Kurdish republic centered on the city of Mahabad, before it was crushed by Iranian forces within less than a year. That history matters because it means the parties forming CPFIK in February 2026 weren't new organizations opportunistically jumping into a foreign-backed war. They were the direct institutional descendants of a resistance movement that's been fighting, in various forms, for Kurdish rights inside Iran for the better part of a century. PJAK's own armed wing, the Eastern Kurdistan units known as the YRK, is estimated, according to Al Jazeera's reporting, to field somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 fighters, many of them women, operating out of the rugged Kandil Mountains straddling the Iran-Iraq border and modeled explicitly after the better-known Kurdish fighting formations that gained international recognition fighting ISIS in Syria. PJAK also maintains a separate women's protection wing, the HPJ, built along those same lines. The economic ripple effects of this sustained pressure on the Kurdistan region have been real too, and they extend well beyond the direct military casualties. According to reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Dana Gas became the first major energy company operating in the region to suspend its operations there, a decision that came after 8 one-way attack drones targeted Erbil in a single night as the broader U.S. Iran exchange of strikes intensified. The Kurdish outlet Rudal Media Network reported at the time that the suspension came directly in response to that drone barrage, as the exchange of strikes between the U.S. and Iran continued escalating around it. That's a detail worth sitting with, because it shows how a conflict framed primarily around Kurdish opposition parties and Iranian military strikes has real direct consequences for ordinary economic activity in Erbil and the surrounding Kurdistan region, well beyond the specific fighters and camps being targeted. Let's talk about what Iran actually did in response to all of this, because regardless of how much of the original offensive claim was accurate, Tehran's reaction was very real, very sustained, and extremely well documented. According to detailed tracking of Iranian strikes on the Kurdistan region of Iraq, beginning February 28th, the same day the broader war started, Iran and Iraqi Shiite militias aligned with Iran under the Popular Mobilization Forces umbrella launched a sustained campaign of ballistic missile and drone attacks, specifically targeting the Kurdistan region. By March 11th, That tracking recorded roughly 200 separate attacks inside Iraq, with the overwhelming majority concentrated specifically on Kurdish areas. Confirmed strikes hit Peshmerga positions near Dagala in Erbil Governorate and the headquarters of Peshmerga Unit 70, affiliated with the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, killing at least one member of the Kurdistan region's Asayish security forces and wounding another. On March 25th, according to a separate confirmed report, an Iranian ballistic missile barrage struck military positions in the Saran district near Erbil, including the headquarters of the 7th Infantry Division and a unit of the 5th Infantry Division, killing 6 Peshmerga fighters and wounding around 30 others, and attacked the Kurdistan region's own Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs, publicly condemned as, in its words, a hostile and treacherous act. That pattern didn't slow down as the war continued. It accelerated. According to reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, published in late July, the Kurdistan region had been hit by more than 850 separate attacks since February, according to figures cited by Majid Glai, president of the American Kurdish Committee, leaving at least 6 civilians dead in the process. On July 17th, Iran struck a Kamala party camp at Zargwazila, killing 9 Peshmerga recruits and wounding 3 others. 2 days later, on July 19th, the Kurdistan Freedom Party accused Iran of using white phosphorus in a separate strike, with that same reporting citing eyewitness observations, medical examinations of 9 wounded Peshmerga fighters, and extensive fires documented at the targeted site as the basis for that allegation. According to the Washington Kurdish Institute's own tracking, Kamala stated its camps and bases had been targeted more than 40 separate times over the course of the war's 39-day active combat phase alone, describing the pattern as a deliberate effort by Tehran to break the will of the Kurdish freedom movement. Let's pause here for the third gut check of this video, because I think this is genuinely the most important reframe in the entire story. If you only heard the March headline about thousands of fighters launching an offensive into Iran, you'd walk away thinking this is a story about Kurdish forces going on the attack. If you look at the actual casualty and strike data compiled over the following 5 months, the story running underneath the headline looks a lot more like the reverse. Hundreds of Iranian strikes hitting Kurdish camps, Kurdish fighters, and Kurdish civilians inside Iraq. Month after month, while Kurdish forces themselves have mostly been documented defending existing positions, absorbing ambushes, and occasionally clashing with IRGC units directly inside Iran's own western border provinces, rather than conducting the kind of large-scale territorial offensive that original I-24 News report described. That defensive, attritional pattern shows up clearly in the specific clashes that have actually been confirmed inside Iran itself, as opposed to the disputed early March offensive claims. On July 1st, according to the Kurdistan Human Rights Network's direct reporting, IRGC forces from the Hamzeh Sayed al-Shohada headquarters ambushed a vehicle carrying 6 party of Iranian Kurdistan fighters near the village of Kezkapan in the Piranshar area, killing all 6. The PDKI publicly named all 6 of the dead: Mohammed Kaki, Twana Osmani, Abdullah Mohammed Pour, Karo Hormoziari, Fardin Changizi, and Mohammed Amin Bayazidi, and confirmed that Bayazidi specifically had been an active member of the party's underground network inside Iran, driving the vehicle when it was ambushed. The IRGC's own announcement, notably, only published photos of 5 of the 6, and made no mention of Bayazidi at all, according to that same reporting, a discrepancy that suggests Tehran may have deliberately avoided acknowledging his specific role inside the country. Separately, on the evening of June 28th, members of PJAK's armed wing, the Eastern Kurdistan units, came under sustained artillery and heavy fire from IRGC forces at the Gagash Heights, between the towns of Mahabad and Piranshar, according to that same tracking. Majid Glai, the American Kurdish Committee president, gave Fox News Digital a really careful, measured read on what this specific wave of clashes actually represents, and I think his framing is worth quoting directly because it avoids both extremes this story tends to get pulled toward. He said the latest clashes shouldn't be read as a full-scale uprising, but also shouldn't be dismissed as routine border violence either. What I'm hearing, he said, is this is not business as usual. This is not like periodic clashes on the border. This is operations, and it seems to be deep inside. That's about as honest an assessment as you're going to find from anyone close to this specific movement. An acknowledgement that something has genuinely shifted in the intensity and depth of these operations compared to the sporadic clashes that have defined the decades-long Kurdish-Iranian conflict before this war, without inflating that shift into the kind of coordinated territorial offensive the original March headlines implied. Kurdish leaders on the political side have been just as careful in how they've talked about their own role in this war, and I think that caution is worth highlighting because it cuts directly against the idea that Kurdish groups have been trying to inflate their own military significance. Hasso Saleh, a Kurdish political analyst with direct ties to the PDKI, told reporters in early July that armed and civil resistance inside Iran remain the two fundamental independent pillars of the Iranian Kurdish opposition, regardless of what's happening in the broader war between Iran, the United States, and Israel. As we repeatedly emphasized throughout the 40-day war, he said, it was not our war. Likewise, the ceasefire and any potential peace agreement are not about us. Our party represents a movement in Iranian Kurdistan that exists independently of any war or peace involving the Iranian regime. That's a striking statement to make in the middle of a conflict where outside powers were actively trying to recruit and arm exactly this movement. A Kurdish party leader explicitly pushing back on the idea that his organization's entire decades-long struggle should be understood as a subplot inside someone else's war. There's another layer of internal complexity worth understanding too. Because the Kurdish coalition hasn't operated inside a unified Iranian opposition movement, it's had to navigate real skepticism from other groups as well. According to reporting from the Jerusalem Post's analysis of the crisis, many other minority groups inside Iran, along with the broader Persian opposition movement, have historically viewed Kurdish separatist ambitions with suspicion. While not worried that a strengthened, internationally backed Kurdish movement might pursue outright independence rather than integration into a reformed, more pluralistic Iranian state. That tension helps explain why Kurdish groups within CPFIK have gone out of their way, in public statements throughout this war, to frame their goals in terms of a democratic, secular, and federal Iran, where all nations and communities can live with dignity and rights. Rather than outright Kurdish independence, language specifically chosen to reassure other Iranian opposition factions that a stronger Kurdish movement isn't a threat to a unified, multi-ethnic post-regime Iran, even while continuing to fight for expanded Kurdish autonomy within it. That same J-Post analysis noted that the Kurdish groups were initially skeptical about entering into any kind of offensive posture back in March 2026 specifically, wary of being used as expendable shock troops in someone else's war without receiving durable political guarantees in return. That skepticism is worth remembering every time you see a dramatic headline about Kurdish forces launching an offensive, because it cuts directly against the narrative of an eager, let's talk about the most recent development in this story, because it shows Iran shifting tactics in a way that extends well beyond the battlefield entirely. According to the Washington Kurdish Institute's tracking published just this week, Iran has begun seeking Interpol red notices and formal extradition requests against leaders and members of Iranian Kurdish opposition parties, including the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, PJAK Kamala, and other prominent Kurdish political figures. Kurdish leaders have rejected that move publicly as a politically motivated tool of what they're calling transnational repression, warning that Tehran is attempting to extend the exact same campaign of intimidation it runs inside Iran's own borders out into the international arena, targeting exiled opposition figures wherever they happen to be living. That's a meaningfully different kind of pressure than missiles and ambushes. It's Iran trying to use international law enforcement infrastructure itself as a weapon against a movement it hasn't been able to fully suppress through 5 months of direct military strikes. So let's bring this all the way back to the title of this video and give it the honest answer it deserves. Did thousands of Kurdish fighters actually do something dramatic to Iran back in March? The most accurate answer, based on everything the documented record actually supports, is that thousands of Kurdish fighters exist, are real, are armed, and were genuinely positioning near and probing across Iran's western border at the start of this war. But the specific claim of a completed, large-scale offensive inside Iranian territory does not hold up against the public denials of every party actually named in the original report, or against the more careful assessments that followed in the weeks after. What actually happened to Iran over the following 5 months wasn't one dramatic Kurdish offensive. It was something slower and, in a lot of ways, more consequential. A newly unified Kurdish political coalition that survived hundreds of Iranian strikes against it, kept fighting in isolated but increasingly significant clashes deep inside Iran's own border provinces, and forced Tehran into pursuing international legal action against Kurdish leaders, specifically because military force alone hasn't been enough to make the movement disappear. I want to be upfront about the limits of what's confirmed here too, the same way I try to be in every video I make on this war. We don't have confirmed, independently verified figures on exactly how many Kurdish fighters are currently active inside Iran at any given moment, how much territory, if any, they currently hold, or how much of the CIA's reported arming program has actually been delivered versus merely discussed. What is confirmed repeatedly across independent Kurdish human rights organizations, defense-focused outlets, and direct statements from the parties themselves is a sustained 5-month pattern of Iranian strikes against Kurdish positions, a real and rising Kurdish death toll from direct clashes inside Iran's own western provinces, and a political coalition that has held together under pressure in a way earlier, more fragmented iterations of the Kurdish Iranian opposition movement never managed to. If you've made it this far, here's the question I want you sitting with. Given everything laid out here, Do you think the gap between the initial March offensive claims and the more measured reality that followed reflects a Kurdish coalition that genuinely overreached in its early messaging? Or does it reflect the reality that a real, ongoing insurgency deliberately keeps its actual capabilities deliberately vague, letting outside observers and potential backers draw their own conclusions, rather than confirming specifics that would help Iranian intelligence target them more precisely? I think there's a reasonable case for both readings, and I'd like to know where you land on it. Before I wrap up, here's exactly where every claim in this video came from. The formation of the coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan on February 22nd, and the broader background on the 5 parties involved, came from detailed tracking of the 2026 Kurdish-Iranian crisis compiled from multiple sources, corroborated by Al Jazeera's reporting on Kurdish groups published March 5th. The CIA's confirmed involvement in arming Kurdish forces came directly from CNN's reporting published March 3rd, citing multiple sources familiar with the plan. The original offensive claim, including the direct quote from the unnamed CPFIK official, came from I-24 News' exclusive report published March 4th. The subsequent denials from PJAK, PDKI, PAK, and Kamala, along with journalist Afshin Ismaili's reporting on 4 Kurdish officials disputing the claim, came from coverage published by The Mirror and corroborated by detailed tracking of the crisis. The on-the-ground assessment of the coalition's actual size and equipment level came from Palladium magazine's reporting published in April, based on a direct visit to a training camp near Erbil. The full scope of Iranian strikes on the Kurdistan region, including the 200 strike figure by March 11th and the specific attacks near Dagala and Saran, came from detailed tracking of Iranian strikes on the Kurdistan region, corroborated by a separate confirmed report on the March 25th Saran attack. The 850 attack figure, the Zargwazila camp strike, and the white phosphorus allegation all came from Foundation for Defense of Democracies, reporting published July 21st. The Kamala camp targeting figures came from the Washington Kurdish Institute's Kurdistan Digest, published July 28th, which also provided the details on Iran's Interpol Red Notice campaign against Kurdish opposition leaders, the July 1st Piranshar ambush, and the names of the 6 PDKI fighters killed came from the Kurdistan Human Rights Network's direct reporting, and Majid Gli's and Aso Saleh's on-record comments came from Fox News Digital's reporting and Kurdistan 24's coverage, respectively. Every claim in this video traces back to one of those sources, and I genuinely encourage you to read the originals before drawing your own final conclusion about what's actually happening along Iran's western border. This is a story that's easy to flatten into a single dramatic headline, and I think that's exactly why it deserved this level of detail instead. The real story here isn't one clean, cinematic Kurdish offensive that did or didn't happen on a specific night in March. It's a decades-old movement that finally achieved a level of political unity it had never managed before, tested that unity against 5 months of sustained military pressure from a government willing to use ballistic missiles, drones, white phosphorus allegations, and now international law enforcement to try to break it, and, as of this recording, is still standing. It's worth remembering, too, that this movement's actual goals have never been fully reducible to whatever role outside powers wanted it to play in this specific war. Long before Washington and Jerusalem started weighing whether to arm Kurdish fighters as leverage against Tehran, and long before any single I-24 News report claimed thousands of them had crossed into Iran overnight, this was already a century-old struggle for basic political rights inside Iran's own borders, one that will almost certainly continue in some form, regardless of how the broader war between Iran, the United States, and Israel eventually gets resolved. Aso Saleh's comment that this isn't our war and that any peace agreement isn't about us is worth holding on to as the most honest single line in this entire story, a reminder that the Kurdish movement's own timeline and objectives were never fully synchronized with the war being fought around it, even when outside coverage, including the initial March headlines that inspired this video, sometimes made it look that way. Whether that translates into something bigger in the months ahead, or whether it settles back into the same kind of sporadic, decades-long, low-intensity conflict that's defined Iranian Kurdistan for most of the last century, is something I'll keep tracking closely. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.